In this lecture series, we're going to talk about emphasis, hierarchy, and focal point. Let's start with emphasis, if I can get there. So one of the most obvious things I could say is that you can't emphasize everything. It defeats the point of emphasis. However, I feel like I need to say it because one of the things I've seen over the years in students who are studying design is that because they're putting things in their composition, they feel that it is important, therefore they should emphasize it. And I get it, but you can't. Because if you try to emphasize everything, you'll end up emphasizing nothing. They'll all be yelling for attention at the same time. Everything is loud, so nothing is heard. And so the example on the right is nothing is being emphasized in the first image. Everything is being emphasized in the second image. Now, I like the colors, but they're all equal. What's the focal point? How do we address it? How do we change it? How do we make it different? All right, well, let's talk about that. What happens if we change the design so that everything is no longer equally emphasized? What does it do to the overall design? So I've taken the first set of 6 cubes, and in the one above the box, I've just changed one of them to red. And then the one below, they're all pink, but one of them's blue. So emphasis is relative. For one element to stand out, others have to serve as the background from which the first is to stand out. Essentially, some elements need to dominate others in order for your design to display any sort of visual hierarchy. And visual hierarchy is important to leading the eye around the design. Otherwise, it just gets stuck in one place, or it doesn't know where to go at all. If you compare any two elements in a design, you're going to see that they are either equal or one is exerting dominance over the other. The more dominant element is going to attract the eye and get noticed first. That's your focal point. That's your entrance into the composition, into the model, into the form, into the building. It may appear to exhibit some sort of control over the less dominant element, but it doesn't have to. In general, the more dominant element usually has a greater visual weight than the elements that it dominates. And here, example. The two top shapes are identical, therefore equal. There's no dominance. Other than you could say technically the one on the left is dominant from the perspective that if your eye has to go somewhere, it goes there because of our society reading left to right, top to bottom. So that upper left-hand corner, or that initial starting point, does become dominant psychologically. That's why when you show somebody 3 equal doors and ask them to pick one, most people's first inclination is to pick the first door, and then they second guess that and pick a different door. But it's just because that's where eye goes first. So in the middle, the bigger shape dominates. Our eye goes there first because it's larger. On the bottom, 2 circles, our eye goes to the left rather than the right because it is heavier visually. So as you start to develop your design, you're going to see elements starting to exert dominance over each other. Some will dominate, some will be subordinate. And unless you're controlling it consciously, you're just kind of hoping that it all works out. The good thing is you do have control. For example, if you design one element to have more dominance than another by giving it more visual weight, it will stand out. The greater the visual weight, the more the element is going to attract the eye, therefore exhibit dominance. You create dominance through contrast, emphasis, and relative visual weight. Here, Zaha Hadid's, I don't know, it's a center, cultural center. You can see where to enter this building from a distance because of the dominance of the entrance. Because that tower is taller than the rest of the building, the eye goes there, creates a focal point, hence you know how to get in the building. Identical objects don't dominate. So one element has to be different from the elements around in its surroundings so that it can. Your goal is to create elements with noticeable differences in visual weight. So here we go. How do you do that? Common characteristics you can vary to create different visual weights. Size. Bigger is heavier. Shape. Well, form. Let's call this shape/form. Anything with mass is heavier. Of course, now it messes up my whole thing. I'll get over it. Yeah, you see all my stuff aligns, not exactly perfectly, but I spend time making sure that it does, because if I'm teaching it, no, it doesn't on the bottom. I could move that down, but now everything's off on the page. Because you guys probably weren't aware of this, but these headers are on the same place on every page, and that unifies my PowerPoint. You become more conscious of it the more you do it, because your conscious brain starts to look for it. Okay, color, darker is heavier. With value, high contrast is heavier than low contrast. In texture, rough is heavier than smooth. In density, thick is heavier than thin. Saturation, the brighter is heavier than the non-bright. I mean, the more saturated it is, the heavier it is. And in orientation, higher is dominant. And so I've applied multiple dominance to these two shapes. Okay, so there's no circle at all. So the square, it's really interesting how you don't see your own errors when you're working on it too long. You have got to step away. So the square here is dominant over the circle in every single way. It's bigger, has more mass, is darker, higher in contrast, that's outline, has texture, is thicker, is brighter, and is higher on the page. It's so dominant that you barely even notice the circle. You can create dominance through visual direction as well. For example, you can surround an element with arrows that point to that element, and people are going to look at it. You can do it with leading lines instead of arrows, because maybe arrows don't work. If there are enough directional cues, the element could become dominant, even if it's of lesser visual weight than the other elements on the page. So I took that circle that in the previous example was barely noticeable and made it the focal point through directional cues. Also, it's the only shape in that area that's of color. So do you notice the circle now? Well, absolutely. You can have codominance. However, they're going to compete with each other. So if you're going to do codominance, restrict the number of those repeating elements, so that, because if you keep going, say if you had 12 of these, you would lose the idea. When you have a single element of dominance, it now becomes a focal point. Here, all 5 waves are the same height, so there's no dominance. What if just this one was a little bit bigger? Right? So we have the unity of shape, but now it's kind of boring and not very interesting. So what if we just made this one just a little bit bigger, or big enough, 1.5 times bigger? That would create dominance, but it would also maintain our unity and create some variety. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and we'll continue in the next video.